Alright guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this. A Zastava ZPAP M70 chambered in 7.62x3.9. Now in order to talk about this, we are going to talk about a little bit of history. And guys, if that's not necessarily something that you're interested in, because I do think this particular portion will take a little while, go ahead and check the description where I will have outlined different chapters and all that kind of stuff, and you can jump to content that you actually want to consume. Now, for the rest of you, let's hop into history. Now, I don't necessarily want to go into the full-blown history of the M70 rifle, which was the Yugoslavian pattern of the AK, the designation for the Yugoslavian pattern of the AK. However, we will discuss where this rifle differs from that in a couple of different places. But what I do want to discuss is Zastava as a company, which was established in 1853 and has been producing weapons for Yugoslavia and now Serbia ever since. Now, how did we get to the point of Serbia, well, current Serbia, then Yugoslavia, producing AKs? Because something that's very important to remember is that Yugoslavia had never actually joined the Soviet Union. So how did they get Soviet pattern weapon systems? Now, in general, as Americans, we have a tendency to oversimplify the Soviet Union and consider it all Russia. Russia was everything. And to some extent, that's true, but it's not nearly the condition that you blow it out to be. It's actually, the former Soviet Union was actually a conglomerate of member states, very similar in construction to NATO, who linked up socially, politically, economically, as well as militarily. And the whole idea was to establish a standardization of weapon systems and other things, and there was a lot of political factors that played into how different technical data packages flowed across those countries, and there's a lot of stuff that gets involved in it. So much so, and this is something, this understanding was something that I lacked until I taught in Ukraine a couple of years ago. And I would sit there, I would work with these guys, and I would bring up different military weapon systems and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of them kind of looked at me quizzically whenever I brought up Yugoslavian type things, asking me, well, where did that one come from? And I would kind of flabbergasted myself. I'd say, well, it's Yugo. And they would go, oh, Yugoslavia, oh, type of thing. They never encountered those weapon systems because not only was Yugoslavia not necessarily a part of the Soviet Union, but if you weren't in, say, Czechoslovakia at any time during that time, you're from Ukraine and you never go to Czechoslovakia, you're never necessarily going to interact with those weapon systems. So you may not necessarily know them. That was something that I found very interesting. Now, how did Yugoslavia wind up getting a hold of these types of weapon systems? Now, though Yugoslavia was not a member state of the Soviet Union, they still had a partnership. They still had a political link because they are communist, or they were communist. So they would actually wind up buying the tooling for the SKS whenever the Soviet Union pretty much went away from the SKS. And they would produce first the M59 and later on the M59-66. Now, eventually they would replace those weapon systems with their own select fire assault rifle type layout, and they would designate that the M70. Now, the weapon system would prove to be a very hardy and durable weapon system, and eventually Yugoslavia would start exporting it to other countries, Iraq included. Now, inevitably, a civil war would kick off in the region, and Yugoslavia would devolve into some pretty horrific fighting and terrible war crimes. And during that time, they would stop any type of export. They would pretty much bring all weapon systems into themselves. After the war ended and Yugoslavia broke up, Serbia would wind up with Zastava in its holdings and would start exporting weapon systems yet again. Now, this is kind of where we start to talk about the U.S. market as well, because then Yugoslavian, now Serbian AKs are back on the market. And this is where we get OPAPs, NPAPs, all these different types of rifles, and they would see some disruption in flow. They would come in kind of bursts and all that kind of stuff, and they would come in fairly inexpensively. Guys would buy them up, and then they would disappear for a little while. Then there would be another production of rifles. Guys would buy them up. They disappear for a little while. Now, the 1994 assault weapons ban would change a lot of these dynamics. And up until it sunsetted in 2004, we wouldn't necessarily see as many imported rifles, or we would see them in very much so sporterized type conditions. After 2004, we would start to see Yugoslavian quote-unquote NPAPs come in. There would be kit guns coming in as well during different times. Now, in 2016, Zastava announced that they would be opening an American branch. And that is when we started seeing the ZPAP rifles, which, though it was a little shaky at first, we're now seeing consistent importation of the ZPAPs. They were quite available. So that brings us up to our current state with this particular rifle. So let's go over the features. Starting off right off the bat, we have a 16.3-inch cold hammer forged, now chrome lined barrel. That is something that definitely stands out, because previously it was pretty much understood that you wouldn't see any Yugoslavian, now Serbian rifle with a chrome lined barrel. It just didn't happen. They've been consistently unlined for years. And there's a lot of discussion as to whether or not that is a good thing. Some people cite the fact that an unchrome lined bore or a non-coated bore is generally more accurate. You have better contact with the bullet as it passes down the barrel. However, it's easier to clean and maintain a lined barrel, especially chrome lined. And there's been a lot of different reasons cited for why they didn't go to chrome lining. Issues with actually being able to execute the procedure to chrome line, or perhaps they didn't have enough chromium deposits within the country. Whatever the situation may be, for a long time, it was just an accepted standard that Serbian and Yugoslavian AKs did not have coated bores. However, now that has changed with the ZPAP, and we finally have chrome line bores. And I consider this a good thing, because I like the durability of chrome lining. Now, of course, consistency in the coating of the bore and all that kind of stuff could impact accuracy. You could wind up with areas that are thin or areas that are thick in the actual chrome lining, but it's an AK. I'm not necessarily worried about precision accuracy. As long as it's giving me minute of man, I'm happy, and we'll talk about that more here in a bit. Now, here we have our sugar scoop muzzle brake, which actually, interestingly enough, you can depress this little detent right here, and then you can change the direction that this vents gases. Right now, I have it timed in such a manner that it should counteract the movement of the charging handle during functioning. You can, of course, swap this out for whatever muzzle brakes that you want to be able to utilize. This does have 14x1 threads. And one of the great things is you shouldn't be too concerned about concentricity with these particular threads, because these are current production rifles. It's not a bad thing in general to default to checking that on AKs, but I would feel pretty reasonable with not doing that on this particular batch. Now, you give me an old Wasser 10, I'm going to go get it checked out for concentricity, because that is a noted issue with those particular rifles. Now, we have our standard AK front sight, which is adjustable for windage and elevation. This rifle has a cleaning rod on it, which you will not necessarily find that out of the factory. We have a standard AK sling swivel here with a military canvas sling. We have the 45-degree gas block of the original AK-AKM pattern. As we can see here, I've made a modification to this gas tube. This did originally come with the standard AK gas tube. However, I wanted to be able to set this up as a fighting rifle, so I needed to be able to add lights, and AKs in that type of configuration don't necessarily lend themselves well to adding lights. So I swapped out originally for a Midwest Industries railed gas tube. However, one of the things you have to keep in mind with Yugo pattern or Serbian pattern rifles is that they do not take AK or AKM parts, and that includes the gas tubes. And I thought I ordered a Midwest Industries railed Yugo or ZPAP or M70, I guess I should say, gas tube. However, it wound up being an AKM pattern, so I had to get rid of that, and instead I got this Ultimak rail, which I'm very happy with. Just go ahead and cover this real quick here. This was easy to install. It came with fantastic instructions, and it actually wound up fitting in here into this handguard perfectly without needing any additional dremeling, which a lot of times whenever you're looking at AK aftermarket parts, you wind up having to round some edges or something like that, grind it to the actual shape that you need it to be able to fit it onto the individual rifle, because there's a lot of tolerance issues with AKs. There's quite a wide variance between different manufacturers. This came together no problem, and I really appreciate that, because I was fully prepared in my mind to have to Dremel out this handguard or something along those lines. And this is a bomb-proof attachment. I am actually really impressed with this design. I like this a lot. Now, here mounted, I have a Surefire M620, and I actually forgot the manufacturer of this light mount. I'll annotate it down below. Now, this originally came with the standard 90-degree Picatinny mount. Now, of course, with this rail setup, that's not going to work out. It's going to obscure my optics and my sights and all that kind of stuff, and that's just not going to be a good result for me. So I started shopping around for some sort of offset mount, and I ran into a lot of issues, because as it turns out, the Surefire M620 is not a very popular offering, and it does not lend itself to the same adaptability or parts as the M600 300 Scout Light series. Now, I finally found this offset mount, got it set up, and unfortunately, I'm having more contact with this rail than I thought I would when I installed it. So sometimes I have to go through and kind of make sure that this is staying tight. It has worked itself loose once. I've come back in and hit it with some Loctite. Hopefully that issue does not persist. Now the 620 is selectable between IR and white light. I'm really only interested in the white light portion of it at this point. And you'll note that I've kept the clicky cap. That is because I don't particularly care for the increased possibility of negligent discharges of light utilizing pressure pads. It's something to take into consideration. Pressure pads have their time and place. However, whenever I can afford it, I prefer to run clicky caps. They're a little bit more reliable, less likely to discharge light when I don't want it to. Now, as you can see here, I kept the wooden handguard. This is a lovely red. I absolutely love the look of this, and I really went back and forth for a long time as to whether or not to build this out to be a more tactically minded rifle, because I loved the red. I loved the red on the gas tube as well, and I really wanted to keep that look. But I actually think this kind of tactical and old school mix here is pretty tasteful. We'll get into that more as we go. All right, now our rear sight is left in the white. It is adjustable for elevation out to 1,000 meters. Pretty standard AK rear sight. Now, let's talk about our optic real quick. I have a Holosun 403C, which is solar powered. Now, you can select between running this solar powered or running off of the battery. I have been running this entirely solar powered at this point. The brightness of the dot does adjust based off of light input, and so far I've had no real issues. I've shot it in a lot of kind of overcast conditions and all that kind of stuff, and I've had absolutely no issue being able to pick up the dot. One issue that I have noticed is if I'm working in a, say, dark space and I'm looking into a light space, it can kind of wash out the dot a little bit, but that is why you have the battery, so you can switch over to that and then be able to adjust brightness as you see fit. It is a 2 MOA dot, and that's pretty much what I've been running so far. We'll talk a little bit more about this optic in shooting and all that kind of stuff. All right, now, something that sets this rifle apart from previous M70s is that this does have the AK style side rail. And actually, Zastava now produces its own rail as well. It's a relatively lightweight rail. And I decided to run my optics mount off of that. Now, I actually got asked the question not too long ago, why is it that I went with the side rail mount instead of just mounting off of the Ultimak rail? And a lot of that has to do with, at the time, I didn't know that much about the Ultimak rail. I hadn't bought it yet, and I had no idea how well constructed it was, so I didn't plan on putting my optic here. In hindsight, if you have an Ultimak rail, not only buy with confidence, but also mount optics to it with confidence. Any of the reviews that I've seen, a lot of first-person point of view use with it and all that kind of stuff, they have had no issue with zero shift. They've had no issue with heat cooking the optic or anything along those lines. Absolutely, if I were to do this again, I would consider mounting the optic on the Ultimak. I've had no issues with this rail as well. It's sturdy and all that kind of stuff, and this is an excellent mounting point on standard AKs. The side rail mount is an excellent mounting location for optics. So I don't necessarily see a need to fix this, but I can understand why someone would select this option over a side rail, or perhaps you had a rifle that didn't have a rail. Go with the Ultimak. It'll work out great for you. All right, now, of course, we have the standard AK top cover, right? Now, what's interesting about the M70 and its variants is that you have a very different arrangement to how it is that you take this apart. Now, a lot of this comes back to the fact that these rifles were set up to launch rifle grenades. The M70s would have a adjustable rifle grenade sight that would cut off the gas flow so that you could project grenades. And a lot of times we have a tendency to think of muzzle-mounted grenade launching systems as being very archaic. However, they're still utilized in quite a few countries, and they have their own advantages. For the most part, a lot of more developed nations, or leading first world nations, I guess is probably the better way to put that overall, have switched over to underslung grenade launchers, be it the VOG system or the US M203 and any of its variants and all that kind of stuff. that's still a rifle grenade, or it's still performing the same manner as a rifle grenade. So be it over the muzzle or underslung, that's still something that's being utilized in militaries the world over. And that's because you need something that's going to bridge the gap between how far someone can throw a hand grenade and where a better engagement distance for like a 60mm mortar exists. There's an area that needs to be covered in there, and that's where rifle grenades come in. So with you need to be able to load in an extra spicy blank in order to be able to launch a rifle grenade to the distance that you need to, they came up with a lockable system for the cover here so that it doesn't potentially pop off. This actually is very helpful in the disassembly process of this AK, because normally with an AK you press in this plunger, which is attached to your recoil spring, and then you wiggle this off at the same time that you're holding that plunger, and then you take everything apart, and then it's this whole kind of involved process, right? Well, the great thing is you press this button, you push in on the plunger, you release the button, and it holds the plunger in place. Now you can easily remove this top cover and get at the internal components of the firearm. Now, a couple things to talk about here real quick. You will note that generally Yugo and Serbian bolts are left in the white. So this is normal. This is something that's very normal to see. And it is a standard AK bolt. There's nothing really different about this overall. Now, when it comes time to reassemble this, normally you would go ahead and you would set your recoil spring in the front of this dovetail cut on a normal AK. Then you would replace your top cover. You would hold the top cover, run the charging handle, and that would pop this plunger back into its position that it's supposed to be in. You don't have to do that though, because this is still being retained by the button. So you can easily just reinstall your top cover, and then swing this around here for you. Press the button as soon as I can find it, and it pops the plunger back into place. Now your top cover is secure. I love that. It's not a big deal. It's not hard to take it apart in the other way, but it makes it so much easier. It's less fuss, and I appreciate little refinements like that. Now we have the same standard AK dust cover slash safety selector, which also now has a notch cutout in order to be able to hold the bolt into the rear position, which I appreciate. That's kind of nice. Some ranges get really weird about making sure that actions are locked to the rear whenever people are going to go down range, which is a safety consideration. I understand that. And it's generally something that's very difficult to achieve with AKs. But adding this makes it a little bit easier. It's easier to be able to show clear and safe and all that kind of stuff. Competitions and classes, you'll run into similar issues as well. Now, the top cover is not where the grenade launcher oriented aspects of the ZPAP go away. In addition to that, we have a thicker receiver on the M70s, especially later production. The first series M70s were 1mm thick receivers. They eventually went to 1.5mm thick, which is interesting because, once again, we're talking about this rifle being built not just for grenade launching, but longevity in general. This is a stamped receiver, and we have our magazine nipples located right here. Now, in addition to that, we also have a bulged RPK trunnion, which again, being able to deal with the higher pressures of launching grenades, as well as just in general being a long-term use type rifle. These are over-designed, and I love it. I absolutely love that that is what they chose to do with these rifles, to just make them absolutely bulletproof. Because that's what I want out of an AK anyway. And these were designed so that everyone could be a grenade launcher if they needed to be, which I also kind of appreciate that simplicity, because not all militaries who utilized muzzle-mounted grenade launchers did that. All right, so our magazine well will take double stack magazines. And how well does it take magazines? So, starting off with this, Tapco. Oop. It's a little tight, but it fits. Now this is a Korean lightweight magazine. It fits, but it has quite a bit of wiggle to it. I've had no reliability issues though. Here's a Magpul. Here's a 40-round Steely magazine. Fits, a little bit of wiggle. I've had a lot of issues with this magazine in my Galil Ace. I've got to hit the angles just right in order for it to actually lock in properly. Here's a 30-round Steely. Fits pretty well. And then this rifle came with an actual Yugo/Serbian magazine. And those types of magazines is that the follower has a last shot hold open feature. Now, of course, this feature is linked entirely to the magazine. So as soon as you remove the magazine, the bolt will go home. But it does give you that opportunity to let you know that the magazine is empty. And original Z70s or M70s did have the ability to be locked to the rear. The bolt did have a last shot hold open capability. They eventually deleted that, however, but they kept the follower in the magazine. I was actually very excited for this magazine when I got it. It was a surprise. There's being excited about your new AK. But then there's finding out you have a last round hold open magazine. I don't know why it was a surprise. I should have known that would be the case, but I didn't at the time. All right, now we have our standard AK magazine release, flapper type setup. All right, now the trigger. Let's go ahead and talk about the trigger. We do have the double hook trigger on this particular rifle, and I've got to be honest, guys, I'm a little torn on this particular trigger. So one of the things that I've noticed is that there's not really a wall, or not much of a wall, I guess I should say. I hope the mic's not going crazy for you guys. If it is, I apologize. But so right here, I can feel a catch, but it's very easy to roll right through it. And this thing, it's a very smooth trigger. It feels like it's on ball bearings, kind of like something that I would expect out of maybe a double action revolver trigger or something along those lines. And it can make precise shooting with this a little difficult because I'm used to a much more defined wall in like an AR-15 trigger. So it's an interesting complaint to have. I imagine that if I were to like do a lot of mag dumps with this thing, I would really enjoy this trigger because it would happen very naturally. But trying to like really bear down on the sights and all that kind of stuff and get good, accurate shooting out of it, so it's a little bit of a surprise. And it's something that can be easily trained or worked around. I just haven't had the time yet. Wow, this is really being a pain right now. So, all right, now this, then of course it goes right on. Anyway, now this came with the Tango Down pistol grip, which I do appreciate. It is very comfortable. Now, I have a tendency to not necessarily get really broken up over pistol grips and all that kind of stuff, but I will say that a lot of times an AK, especially like standard military type pistol grips, they're very small. And this is actually quite comfortable. There's a lot to be able to hang on to here. Now, it does have a compartment in which I keep a battery for the Holosun 403C, as well as the tool to be able to remove the battery. And this is a complaint that I have with the 403C, is that the battery is installed horizontally in this little slit right here. And you do have to use that very small tool in order to be able to remove these non-captive screws in order to be able to replace the battery. Now, of course, in theory, it shouldn't be an issue. You've got the solar feature and all that kind of stuff, so if for some reason the battery died, you will still have the dot. However, since the dot doesn't necessarily work well, like 100% well in all lighting conditions, especially as you traverse lighting conditions, that's something that I would find annoying personally. Is it likely to be an issue? No, it's got great battery life and it's something I can stay on top of. It would be my fault if it went down during like a course or something like that and I wound up being restrained by the features of this particular optic. That would be my fault. That wouldn't be anyone else's. And I still had the ability to quickly remove this rail and be able to get onto my iron sights, and that's just going to be the punishment for not preparing properly. All right, now we come back to our stock here. Now, the ZPAPs come in a variety of different stock configurations. You can get them with wood stocks, you can get them with folding stocks, or you can get them with this fixed triangular stock as well as a side folding triangular stock. This is a fixed triangular stock, and it does come with these little QD cups right here. However, I kind of like the look of this thing, just kind of, you know, twisted around the stock here. We'll talk about this more here in a bit. This stock has some aggressive checkering on the back, so it does grab on to your shirt. However, it is kind of short, and it's definitely built for the average Eurasian male, which is shorter than your average Western male. So something to consider there. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? Amazingly, that is how this thing shoots. This is an absolute joy. The recoil impulse is very smooth. The trigger, while kind of difficult to find the wall and all that kind of stuff, whenever you're shooting it a little bit more rapid, it is very enjoyable. It's very easy to get it behind and all that kind of stuff. The only complaint I have at this point is that based off of the optic mounting on AKs in general, then the length of stock and all that kind of stuff, I do have to get more of a chin weld as opposed to a cheek weld in order to be able to kind of keep my head more upright and be able to track the optic better. But it's comfortable-ish. It's just something I kind of have to remind myself whenever I work around this rifle, do a couple of practice ready-ups and all that kind of stuff, and then I can work around it and do what it is that I need to do. Now, accuracy-wise, I have pretty much only shot this rifle with Tula ammunition, 124 grain and 122 grain FMJs. I have gotten pretty good accuracy overall. I have this thing zeroed in at 100 yards. And here, most recently, I got this 4-inch group at 100 with 122 grain Tula FMJ. Now, I've got to be completely honest, guys. Here recently, I don't know if it's just I've got a bad batch or what, I have not been impressed with the accuracy out of 124 grain Tula. So, you know, there's a lot of fluctuation in the quality of Tula ammunition. I think that's probably just a bad batch, but that 122 grain stuff I have had is pretty good. It seems to give pretty consistent, okay or average AK accuracy out of it, where I've gotten some pretty abysmal groups out of the 124 grain stuff. Just my own personal observation. Now, all right, so that's shooting. What is kind of my personal relationship with this rifle? Well, I've been looking around for an AK for quite some time. And one of the problems with the AK market is that it is horribly inflated right now. Prices are way up. And this causes a lot of people to kind of scoff at the cost of AKs right now, because people were thinking back to when they were $300-400. I passed up on multiple Wasser 10s at one point at about like $480 just a couple of years ago. And now I'm kind of kicking myself because I'm trying to scratch that AK itch, and I'm having trouble getting into an AK for under $1,000. These MSRP for less than $1,000. Availability is kind of a different thing, because though they are consistently coming in, they're also consistently flying off the shelves just as fast. This, I was actually on a business trip not too long ago, and I found this in a local to where I was gun shop, and though used, it was kind of at the upper end for a used price, it was still under $1,000, and I couldn't possibly pass it up. So that is how this wound up in my collection. Now, of course, this is not an AK or AKM pattern rifle. It's its own individual thing. One of the things I forgot to mention before, by the way, is that you can tell Yugo/Serbian AKs by the 3-slot handguards. Forgot to mention that. So, this is still another AK variant, just like my Galil Ace and my PSL 54C, but it still has the form factor, it still has that kind of layout, and it still is a absolutely fantastic rifle. This thing is punching well above its weight. These are exceedingly good. I would highly recommend at the drop of a hat. So that's kind of getting to my end point here. Like, this is a great rifle. You would not be wrong in going with this particular option, especially if you can find it for the right price. Now, how do I feel about how it is that I've laid this out overall? Because I was kind of looking for a sort of crossover mix when it comes to styles. I wanted to have tactical capabilities represented on this particular rifle while still trying to retain a lot of its original charm. And personally, I think it came off without a hitch. It actually came with this sling already set up in this way, and I really like this kind of simple, practical type setup here. Yeah, I could go and I could get a QD cup and get a QD sling swivel right here and be able to have a QD capability on it, or this works. And this is simple. I really like this practical type nature, and then I also like this tactical type nature included as well that I've added to it. And this to me speaks to, you know, if I were to see this on the battlefield, I'd be like, oh, that guy's been putting in some work, and he's been adding upgrades that make sense, not necessarily upgrades that make it look cool. Though, in my opinion, it does kind of look cool, but I leave that up to the individual to decide for themselves as to whether or not this is actually cool looking. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular rifle. I hope you found this review interesting overall and helpful, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day. All right, guys, if you stuck around for a little bit longer, just so you know, if you enjoy this content and you want more access to it, an opportunity for, you know, discussions and all that kind of stuff, hop in the description. I will have annotated the link there to the channel's Facebook page, and we'd love to see you there. So with that, have a good day.